Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Writer's Digest Presents, a monthly podcast of writers helping writers. This month's topic, beginnings. Since this is our first episode, let's introduce ourselves. I'll go first. I'm Amy Jones, editor-in-chief of Writer's Digest. I've been working at Writer's Digest since, 2017 in various roles. First working on the Writer's Digest books, and then working on the website and helping out with the conferences, and now editing the magazine. And I love it. Robert, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself next?
Yeah, I've been with the Writer's Digest team for over 20 years now. Started as an unpaid intern, just getting college credit back in 2000, and was lucky enough to end up with the Market Books group doing Writer's Market, and I think I worked on every single one. They had like a songwriters market, artist, graphic designers market, stuff like that. But now I'm a senior editor, and sort of my main tasks are kind of managing the online content, stuff that goes on writersdigest.com, doing our virtual conferences, which are a lot of fun and a lot of great speakers with those. And then beyond that, I just kind of consider myself kind of like the person who's like kind of the duct tape of the group, doing a bunch of things for everybody to help out. So it's a lot of fun. And I guess I'll pass the baton on over to Mariah now.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Mariah Richard. I have been with Writer's Digest a little over a year now. And it was one of those things where the company I had been editing for had a massive layoff because of COVID, and I just happened upon WD's site, and they said that they were accepting applications, so I applied, and I was sort of hired very quickly. It just, all the stars aligned for it. So I have had a few roles since I've been here. I started out working mostly with the online content, and then this year I had the opportunity to sort of jump over into working more with the magazine. So my role here is really just to help our contributors to get their articles ready for publication, help Amy to assemble the magazine and get that ready for print. And I also do still write for our blog occasionally, and I assist with competition winner selection. So that's me in a nutshell, and I will pass it off to Michael.
Thank you. My name is Michael Woodson. I've been with Writer's Digest just for like 4 months now. I was at a children's publisher and a literacy nonprofit before that. And then due to COVID, was let go and took this opportunity and applied. And I'm so glad that I did. And my responsibilities are pretty much a lot of online content with Robert, but I also touch the magazines a little bit. I do a little bit of social, and I also help with competitions as well. So, yeah.
I think this is what I enjoy about our entire group. None of us do just one thing, which is what I thought editors just read writing and edited it before I actually became one. And then I realized that's just a small portion of the job. There's so much more that goes into it. And for me, that keeps it really interesting. So today's episode is all about beginnings, which makes sense because not only is it the first episode of this brand new Writer's Digest Presents podcast, but it's also January, which is, of course, when everyone is making plans and goals for the new year. And we're going to have some special guests and other conversations in this episode. But before we get to them, I wanted to know how each of you sort of feel when you begin a brand new writing project. Because I think for me, it is a little nerve-wracking, not because of like the blank page, but because I'm already critiquing myself. And even though I know revision is a part of the process and always will be, I am still judging my own writing before it even gets on the page. And it's always fine when I have started the draft and I'm a few paragraphs into it. I feel much better about it than I did pre-writing it when I was judging. But it's actually putting those first few words down that is a little challenging for me. Please tell me I'm not the only one.
Yeah, for me, I always think of beginnings as a lot of fun. I try not to hold myself back too much when I get started. I just kind of dive in and see where it's going. A lot of times that can lead to nowhere. so I have to back up and start again. But I always think the beginnings are like a lot of fun because of all the potential, and then the real world or my limit of writing ability kind of knocks me down a little bit, and it's when you start getting into the middle parts or the after I do a lot of poems, getting into the revision parts where it's like, okay, now that we had the fun part, not that revision can't be fun, but like it's more like how do we try to make this something that I would want to share with somebody besides myself. And but the beginning part is always like, all right, yeah, let's go at it.
I'm a little bit different in the way that I'm just the super type A human being, so I need to have a plan for everything. I am a planner through and through. Even when it comes to NaNoWriMo, I have never once been a pantster ever. But for me, the beginning of a story happens way before I get to the page. Part of that is just because of the genres that I like to write. I'm very much like a fantasy, urban fantasy, horror kind of writer. So a lot of my world building, research, that kind of thing. But it's also a lot of just living in the world inside my head. Even just, doing my day-to-day life. Sometimes I'll pause, what would my character do about that? What would they say? How would they feel? And really feeling like I know that world through and through and the way that it makes me feel, so that by the time I get to the blank page, I just have to put it down because it's already alive and complete in my brain. So a lot of my writing actually takes place off the page, and then I just have to go ahead and go through with it.
This is really interesting because I love starting new projects. Like, my favorite part of it is the first sentence, and I think it's because the kind of books I like to read and the kind of books I'd like to write are what my friends call books about nothing. Nothing really happens, but life is happening. And I feel really confident in my first sentence, and then I immediately lose track. So I need to do more planning, like Mariah saying, because depending on the project that I'm doing, with short stories, I can carry that through to the end. But with longer, when I'm trying to write a book draft, it's just harder to not plan. I can always start strong. I always feel relatively encouraged by my first 10 pages, and I'm like, well, that was fun. I guess that's done. Another unfinished project. But yeah, I actually really love beginnings.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things on the Author Spotlight series that we do on the website is reading the different answers for writing process surprises because you really get a feel for like how different writers, like some are like really big on plotting ahead of time, and some talk about how they just can't do that. They have to do the pantsing method where, they're making it up as they go along, and then they might write a whole book and realize they have to go back to like chapter 1 or chapter 3 and then redo the whole thing. So it's interesting how like for everyone it's like a little bit different.
And it's so funny when most of the writing that I've been doing lately has been for the magazine, so it's nonfiction. But as I've tried to start novels over the years, I never plan them out. And that makes zero sense to me because I plan every other part of my life like it depends on it. I've already planned what I'm having for dinner, not just tonight, but next week, because that's how I work. And so maybe this is why I struggle so much with getting started, because I don't plan the writing that I'm going to do. It makes no sense.
But it does. That actually makes a lot of sense to me, because like what you're describing are things that like you need to survive. And so like I always tell myself, like I don't have to plan this because it's not calories I need. But if I want this goal to happen, I need to change my how I do it.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I found interesting, Robert, you talked about writing the first draft as the fun part, and the revising is not quite as much fun for you. The revising is the most fun part for me, and I think like that clearly makes sense because I'm an editor by trade. And so of course I would have fun playing with words and moving them around. That's my form of Sudoku, I think.
Yeah, and I can have fun with revision. It's just that first draft, I'm usually, like, especially when we're talking poetry, there's usually like an idea or an image that kind of sparks it. And then you're like off to the races, like kind of writing. Or like, at least in my case, I'm just like kind of off to the races writing. Whereas the revision, it's more like I like to play different like word games, and like I can buy one of those $1 Sudoku books and like spend an entire weekend just doing Sudoku, which is pointless and doesn't do anything for anyone. But I can just like get caught up in that, and I kind of feel like revision's like that type of game for me. Like the writing part's like this, all this inspiration and writing all this stuff out, and then the revision's more like, all right, now we're gonna almost play Tetris for people who have ever played Tetris. It's kind of a dated reference, but just like kind of fitting all the different pieces together in the right way.
But it's funny that we all think of it like a game, kind of in that way. Like this is our version of fun.
Yeah, I will say, like, going back to like college, that's not how I always thought about it. And that's a lot of times, like, I try to tell writers who are really against revision, and there are a lot of them, meet them at the conferences and events, is, I used to be intimidated by revision because it seemed like such a big thing to do. Like, it's hard enough just to write it, and then to go back through and revise is like, I always try to say, like, instead of thinking of it as revision, if it helps you, like, think of it as like recreating the writing that you did, and and treat it more like a game where it's for fun.
And I think for me, when I was younger, I strived to be like Stephen King, who only ever writes a book one time. And I think part of that is because I've been a huge fan of his since I was like, I think I read The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon in 4th grade. I think that's when like I really started being a fan of his. But I kept running into, like, I would get really frustrated with myself because at the end of a draft, the story wasn't quite saying what I wanted it to say. And so I've learned, especially as I have become more of an editor, and I do kind of think about it as like I have a writing brain and I have an editing brain, and I have to like trade those brains back and forth like a hot potato when I'm working. But I always think to myself, like, it's okay if this first draft isn't there yet, because the next draft is going to pull out one more layer, and then the next draft after that is going to pull out something else. And I think the problem for me is falling into a trap where you can revise something. So, I mean, every time you revise a story, you can make it completely different, but there has to be a stopping point. Like, so I really rely on a group of writing friends to kind of tell me, like, enough is enough, the story is done, or else I'll just pick at it forever and then no one else will ever see it but me.
Mariah, you make a really good point, because I'm also in a writer's group who keep me really accountable for my writing, and especially this past year with NaNoWriMo, we would meet, and because my issue is just getting hung up on kind of what you're saying, like it not being how I'm visualizing it yet. And most recently when we met, they read a part of what I had written that I was not feeling very strongly or confidently on, and my friend Lily said, there is something here, so just keep going. And that was what I needed to hear, because at the same time as I totally believe in revision, but don't worry about revision until you need to be revising.
And something that I have learned, I learned it as an editor from like my editing position, but then looking back, I was like, oh man, this is actually really useful for me as a writer, is that a lot of times, especially if I'm writing a longer project, I'm actually writing two stories. So I get to a point where I'm like, okay, it seems like the story isn't really going anywhere. I'm not really sure who the story is about at this point. And then I just have to pick. You have to pick one or the other. You can't have both, right? But in knowing that, I've been able to go back to projects that I've abandoned and been like, okay, I now more clearly see that this is who the story is about. This is where the story should go. And shuffle that other story off to the side. And a lot of times I've actually been able to reuse that story in a totally different way. It might not even be with the same characters or the same setting, but the fun thing about these kinds of projects is that you can always begin something completely different. If you have to stop a project, or if a project is quote unquote failed, there's always room for new growth there.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and you can always come back to it. That's always been my experience. And also, like with you mentioning the revision, like continuing revising, it does sometimes even go on after you've been published. My poetry collection, Solving the World's Problems, when I run around speaking and reading those poems at different readings, and even I'm sure next time I go do a reading again, it won't surprise me that I'm reading a poem and then make a note while I'm reading. So I've done this before, I'll make a change right there on the spot. And, and that's why I always advise people to read their work out loud, because you can really catch stuff that makes you stumble. If you stumble when you're reading it out loud, then people are probably stumbling when they're reading it silently.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think this is why I always get nervous about reading things in public, because I do have that inclination to fix things, but I like that you're just improving them. It's fun that poets get to do that. Well, this has been a lot of fun chatting about beginnings. We have a lot more interesting content coming up in this episode, so stay tuned for more interviews and conversations about setting goals and starting the new year off right.
This is Robert Lee Brewer, and I'm here with C. Hope Clark to talk about beginning projects. C. Hope Clark is the author of the Carolina Slade Mysteries, the Edisto Island Mysteries, and a brand new series just releasing, and with a double book release, in fact, is the Craven County Mysteries. She's also the editor of Funds for Writers at fundsforwriters.com, and I want to just thank you for coming on here, Hope.
Oh, always lovely to talk to you, Robert. This is great.
Yeah. So my first question was going to be, like, what are you working on now? But I think you've got an answer already ready to go.
I do. I'm always working on a novel, and I'm always working on Funds for Writers, but I have a double book release that released November 30th on a new series, and it's a series I've been wanting to do for about 5 or 6 years, and I had to twist the arm of the publisher to kind of accept it, but it's fun. And I just signed a 3-book contract for 3 more books in the other 2 series, so there's always something going on.
Wow. Yeah. So this episode, when I asked you to get on this episode, I didn't know about the double book release, but we're talking about new projects and starting new projects. How do you, like, I know you've written other novels and other novel series. How do you go about, like, putting together, like, a double book release? How do you even get started on that type of project?
Well, I thought it was going to be 1 book until the publisher said, this is a new series. We're not releasing 1 book in a series and promising more. And especially in light of COVID, taking 1 year, 2 years to get book 2. So they said, if we're going to do this series, you've got to give us 2. And, this was during COVID, so I had a little more time to write. There was no conferences, there were no book signings, there's nothing to do but write. So I dug in, and this is a first for me. This year we're releasing 3 books.
Wow, that's amazing.
But with COVID, I thought I have no excuse not to write, so that's what I did.
That's a great attitude for going through COVID, for sure. Like, I know I've been all over the map, sometimes writing, sometimes anything but, so that's great. So before we talk about some of these other projects, what is different about the Craven County Mysteries from the other 2 series that you've done before?
Well, I wanted to do make this sort of a trifecta. I already had an amateur sleuth, and I had a law enforcement official in terms of a police chief, and this one is a private investigator. And since it all happens in the low country of South Carolina, I've covered all 3 bases, and I hope to do a crossover where they all actually meet. The 2 protagonists in the other 2 series have met in crossover books, so this is just kind of bringing it around to cover all bases, I guess.
Oh, wow. It sounds like a lot of fun.
Oh, it is. Oh, I love these books.
Yeah, fun to write. I'm sure it's a lot of fun to read as well. I love that whole... Like, a lot of times people talk about world building for fantasy and science fiction, but I think it's applicable to, like, all genres of writing, and this sounds like a fun experience in world building for sure.
It is. And I've designed 3 different worlds for these 3 strong protagonists, and it's fun revisiting them. I was just telling someone the other day, they said, oh, I hear you have another book out. Are you going to write another one? And I said, I'm always writing on a book. Between books, I actually get very bored, just extremely bored. I think I have a routine going now.
Yeah, that's good. I know, well, actually, why don't we talk about the routine stuff for a second? Like, do you feel like that helps you with starting the new projects, that you've kind of got that rhythm going?
Absolutely. And I've preached this ever since I've been in the business, is you need to write religiously and not just here and there when you feel like it, because I think when you keep those gears oiled, it's a lot easier to sit down and just pick up where you left off. And when I'm writing on a novel, it's 1,000 words a day minimum. It doesn't
Wow,
sound
that's
like
great.
much. I mean, to
Yeah.
some people write more, but I can maintain that. And what used to be difficult in reaching 1,000 words, I started off with 500. Now I can write 1,000 words without even thinking about it, and it works well.
That's great. Um, I know that you do other work with funds for writers, and I know in the past, and I don't know if you still do this, but like you used to do like grant proposals and projects like that. Do you feel like you approach writing novels differently than those types of projects, or do you think it's like kind of a similar uh, approach that you use for that?
Well, I think the discipline is the same. I have to set deadlines for the fiction. You always have deadlines for the freelancing and the grant writing and all of that. They come with deadlines. But when it comes to the fiction, sure, there's a contract deadline, but you need to have benchmarks in between so that you can get your words in by that ultimate deadline. And oh, absolutely, I have to religiously have a schedule set up, or it just doesn't work for me. But that's just me. It's,
Yeah. So the publisher will give you a deadline, but like you create your own deadlines of like hitting certain targets.
I do. I do. It's a minimum of 1,000 words a day, and I kind of work in a buffer so that if I have to miss a day or two in the mix, I have some breathing room in there. And of course, then I feel the urge to have to go back in and catch up. And I allow for a few weeks at the end for, of course, editing. And then, but I'm lucky to have a family that kind of supports me. I've got a husband that'll go, "Did you get your words in today?" Before he asked me, to go out on an errand or do you want to go see a movie or anything like that. It's like, "Did you get your words in?" And yeah, I got my words in. So it's a job. I've turned it into a job, but I think the fiction is a little different in that you sink into a new world, and I probably mentally think about it more throughout the day when I'm not writing than I would for nonfiction.
Yeah, yeah, and and that's great about the support system. I know I would not be as productive as I am if my wife wasn't always making sure, that I'm doing my stuff. So that's great.
Yeah, we're lucky. Hmm.
Yeah, we definitely are. Yeah, so if you're starting something completely new, let's say like a nonfiction project, are there things you found that that help you get started from like zero, where you're not moving on the project at all, to actually like getting into a rhythm and moving? Because it's like one thing to like kind of have your rhythm and keep it going, but like kind of going from zero to moving.
Well, I will say when it comes to nonfiction, it's I will research the market first. Who I'm writing for. I want to make sure what they've done before that I am in keeping in line with. So I want to be very comfortable in the environment I'm stepping into. Then I do my research and I keep copious notes. I can't go anywhere without a notebook, and it's messy. I'm probably the only one that can understand it, but I I make notes and I do a loose outline, very loose, because I'm not a rigid outline person. And then it's a matter of just sitting down and creating that opening. Once I can land an opening, the
Mm.
rest flows. Nonfiction is a very easy write for me, and I think it's because I spent my previous career in more of a technical nonfiction arena, and the fiction is a little harder. But no, the
Yeah,
nonfiction just flows. Once I've got the research, the ideas start falling into line.
it's funny that you mention it that way. As you start talking about it, I think a lot of times when I'm, doing blog posts or newsletters, it's kind of a similar feel. To start off with like kind of a loose outline where I know I want to hit certain points. And then, yeah, it's getting that opening. And then once I've got the opening, it's just like kind of like it flows out.
It does.
So,
it does.
So I know, like, when I do poetry, poetry's so much different than everything else that I write. Like, I can just see an image or have a line pop in my head and I write a poem. But it seems like for everything else, I have to like kind of back up for a second, at least have like a rough idea of what I want to do, and then and then do it.
Oh, I work the same way. You know, when I flip over into fiction, it's like running through mud for me. You know, I'm so used to writing nonfiction so fast and so cleanly, and fiction is a more of a struggle because you don't have any, you know, any things in concrete. It's all imagination, and you don't just fall into it and it flows. You've got backstory to work in, dialogue to get right. You know, which characters are in what scene, who's not going to show up in the series this time, who's a new one. You know, all of those moving pieces, as well as trying to think creatively and give the reader something that I haven't done before.
Yeah, so this is a curiosity question. When we do interviews all the time with authors that write novels, where are you on the plotter versus pantser spectrum of writing your novels?
I'm more of a pantser. I tried plotter from beginning to end one time in the early stages, and it was a disaster because I didn't get 5 chapters into the book before the rest of the outline was just shot. I had done so much different, and you know, you get into a chapter and go, oh, that reminds me. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. And so you start heading in a little different direction until by like chapter 5 or 6, the story has taken on a whole new light. I can't do it. But what I tend to do is longhand outline just snippets of ideas for what I call scenes, just moving the story along. Sometimes it turns into 2 or 3 chapters, sometimes 5 or 6, but I do that to get some ideas down, and then I sit down and write those chapters and see where they go. And then I do it again. So it's a hint of an outline, but not much.
It's not getting too far ahead of where you're at any
Right.
given time. It's like headlights.
Yeah, there you go.
See so far. Great. Well, I think this is a great start on starting projects. Thank you so much for coming on here. I want to let everyone know to find out more about C. Hope Clark. I mentioned fundsforwriters.com earlier, but also go to her website, www.chopeclark.com. And thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay, hello everyone. Michael here. I am sitting down with my colleague and co-host and pal, Mariah, who we talk all the time, but recently we were talking and I realized that Mariah is the only person on the editorial team who received her MFA, went for an MFA program. And as an editorial team, something that I think we all love is that our backgrounds are so different and our writing styles and reading habits are so different. And this just conjured up a lot of interesting conversation. And so we thought we would sit down today and talk to you a little bit about the pros and cons of an MFA program. If you are an undecided, soon-to-be graduate, this maybe will help you. It's a conversation that I wish I had heard when I was graduating, because I think it would have better helped me make a decision that may or may not have had a pretty big impact on my life.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think that when we were discussing what we wanted or envisioned for this episode, the first thing that came into my mind is that when I was in my undergraduate degree I got my Bachelor of Arts in creative writing and also in English literature. And my dad's dream for me was that I was going to be the weather girl on Channel 8.
Oh,
So when I told him that I wanted to go and study writing, that was a total departure. And he said, I will help you financially with school. You can study whatever you want, but I need you to give me a clear path for how this will help you financially in the future.
wow.
Because I think that for a lot of us, when we tell our parents that we want to be artists, the starving artist is the first thing that they think of, right?
Yeah.
So when I was in school, I really didn't know what path I wanted to take. I knew I wanted to write, and I knew I loved it and I was good at it, but I didn't know what exactly that looked like. So I thought, hey, an MFA is a continuation of this process. So I went right from undergrad into my MFA program, which can be a little bit atypical depending on what program you go to. Generally, people take like 2 or 3 years between, their first degree and their master's. But not always. We had people in our program who hadn't been in school for many, many years. But I guess my first question to you is, I know that you were thinking about this kind of program when you were in undergrad. So what was an MFA to you? What were your expectations around it? Or, what did you think the program would potentially get you or not get you?
Totally. I love the way you put that. Growing up, I'm going to backtrack a little bit with some inside Michael's brain, which was I also I knew I loved stories. I knew I loved telling them and reading them and watching them and listening to them. I didn't immediately know that I wanted to go into English literature. I thought I wanted to be a film student. And when I went to I went to school undecided because I had transferred to a different school and I just missed the opportunity to apply to the film school. And in that period of being technically undecided, I just kind of tried to think about what it is about film that I loved. And it was always ultimately the story. And I just realized it doesn't have to be film. I'm actually a voracious reader and maybe I want to be a writer. And I was really nervous to tell my parents, which was insane because my mother was a librarian. But I remember calling them from the car once and was just like, I think I decided what I want to major in. And I think it's creative writing. And my mom was like, yeah, that makes sense. And I was like, oh, thank God. Okay, cool. You're cool with this. And I'm so grateful. I'm so glad it was the best decision I could have made at such a young age. And then heading into graduating with my bachelor's, MFA programs weren't really talked about a ton. And they were always talked kind of around. And my teachers all, of course, had MFAs. And it was always kind of a throwaway statement like, well, if you get your MFA, this. Or when you go get your MFA, you'll this. And it was never in line with what I pictured for my career because I knew I didn't want to be a teacher. And that's kind of the sort of the main sentiment was if you want to continue to write and teach, then you need to have an MFA program, go into an MFA program. It just never felt right for me. And I think it was truly just because I lacked information on it. And also because I knew I did not want to teach. And I was about to graduate. My good friend, Justine McNulty, immediately went into an MFA as well. And we were sitting having coffee with a friend who also had gotten into this MFA program. And I think there was just an assumption that I had also applied and was going. And I didn't think anything of it. I just said, no, actually, I'm not going for an MFA. And the third friend was like, well, you're never going to get a job then. You're never going to be a writer. And I was like, oh, really? Like, why do you say that?
Gee, thanks.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, I think I'm good. Actually, I have an interview set up for a writing job. And it's just because I think the image of what that looks like for a lot of young writers is very understandably romantic. And I was I was heading into a more professional, like, editorial world that I was comfortable going for while also writing creatively on my own. The stuff that I didn't consider was, my stuff will still be workshopped. I'll be writing really often. I'll be learning about different styles and just getting better at my craft, possibly. So my knowledge of an MFA program really stopped and started with that it meant I was going to be able to teach, and that would offer me time to write more.
And I think that is something that a lot of undergrad programs fail to realize, is that, I do believe that the MFA is generally packaged as this next step to teaching. And certainly it can be, but it's also a lot more than that. And I do want to just put in a little caveat here that I am not an expert in MFAs. I have gone to a single program. I've not taught in an MFA. I've not been a director of an MFA. I've not ever been a professor in any kind of program. But once you're in an MFA, it's this very strange culture where you talk to people from other programs, and it's like each one is its own little world. And the more that you reach out to people who have gotten MFAs and the more that you compare experiences, there are radically different experiences and there are very similar ones. And part of that is also depends on where you go to school. Right. So I went to school in Philadelphia. I lived in Chinatown. I had a very different experience than my friend who's currently getting her MFA in poetry, and she's going to school in New York City, and she's living in the Bronx. And it's just a very different style, not to mention that she's getting her MFA during COVID. Right. So all of these things really change the way that your MFA program you experience your MFA program. But I do want to talk just a little bit about what an MFA is.
Yes,
because
please.
What I heard from you is that you thought, well, this is either the only way that I can be a quote unquote successful writer, right? Or it's the only way that I can be a teacher.
Yes.
So the weird thing about an MFA, first of all, it stands for a Master of Fine Arts, which is different from another master's program because an MFA is more craft focused, while a master's is much more analytical. So in a master of, say you want to get a master in creative writing, you're going to spend a lot more time reading and analyzing those works, kind of the way that you do in an English class.
Okay.
Where in an MFA you spend more time, like you said, that you didn't realize is that you spend a lot more time writing, doing your own creative works, which is what I actually went to get my MFA for, because I just felt like as I was nearing graduation, I was not willing to leave the bubble. When you're in that space where you have deadlines and you have very strict expectations for what you need to be writing and when, it keeps you focused fully on your craft. And I wanted to meet more writers. I went to a very small campus in rural Pennsylvania, and it was very white. And I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, which was very white. And I thought, if I get to go and be in a city and be in a city program, I'm going to meet so many writers who have different life experiences than me. I was also closeted until my MFA program, so it gave me more confidence, more like I was able to really write the things that I wanted to write and feel comfortable doing that. But of course, I didn't really know any of that when I was applying, right? Because the MFA is, it's about 2 to 3 years, depending on what program you're applying to. And they do specify on their websites. It's not like a surprise. And it's also a terminal degree, so there is no PhD in fine arts, when you go for your MFA, you kind of know that that's going to be the end of the academic line for you.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, this will give me 2 or 3 years of writing, and then I'll have to, quote unquote, enter the real world, start adulting. And there.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So in all of this, I guess what was your goal outside of that? Like in terms of entering the real world, was part of that wanting to teach? Or did you want any of that?
I honestly had no idea.
Sure, yeah, of course.
I was open to it, but I thought it would buy me some more time to really decide what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And it did lead me to editing.
Of course.
And that's because, the structure of an MFA program, every program is different.
Mm-hmm.
The number of credits you have to take is different. Of course, if you go to a 3-year program, they require more credit hours than a 2-year program, yada, yada.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a general structure, right? So you get 1 workshop a semester, and a workshop is when you are writing and having other people review your work. I just realized that I didn't specify that an MFA program is not just for people who got their BA in, or a BA at all. It
Right.
usually has to have some kind of undergraduate degree.
But it doesn't have to be.
Right. You don't have to have, quote unquote, been a writer
Right.
in school. You could go and get a degree in engineering.
Right.
Or study public policy. You could have gone and gotten your PhD in, economics, and you can still apply to MFA programs. They are open to all writers. So back to the workshop. The workshop is where you are presenting your work to a class and having them respond to it. We'll get into more of that later, but the next kind of part of the MFA program is that there are a number of craft, manuscript, or special topics courses. Those are all different words for the same thing.
Okay.
So you probably took craft courses in your undergraduate degree. It's basically just an exploration of a specific topic. So for example, my program had a flash fiction craft course. And that was the first time that I ever was exposed to or wrote flash fiction. Because in my earlier academic years, we studied longer short stories or full manuscripts. For what we called the special topics class, that was a class that was only offered once every 2 years. And that was a journal editing class. So that is how I actually got a lot of my experience that I use in my day job here at Writer's Digest, because we had to make our own literary magazine from scratch. And I had the opportunity in that class to apply and become the editor-in-chief of Tinge Literary Magazine,
Nice.
Which is based in Philadelphia. And so, you get a whole bunch of different experiences with those craft classes. Then the next part of the program is generally a number of elective classes. And this is where every program really splits off.
Okay.
Some universities allow you to take electives in courses that are not in your area. So, for example, you might have been able to take film classes as an MFA candidate if your university had those classes offered and allowed you to commingle, right?
Right.
It was one of those things where I had my English literature degree, but I was not prepared for a master's level English lit course.
Yeah.
It was a wild ride. I had to take 3 for my program. So it was interesting. It was interesting to be thrown into that world. And I very clearly realized that no, an academic pursuit is not for me. Because thinking about being a professor and having to publish and things, to get tenure, I was like, no, ma'am.
Wow.
That was not going to happen for me. So then the other two kind of not class-related aspects of programs are the comprehensive exam and the thesis.
Yeah, I don't
So-
know anything about a comprehensive exam.
Yeah, so this is not anything that I knew until I started applying. And every program is different. So the comprehensive exam is really just a way for the school to summarize your learning, right? So it's either a literal exam that you have to sit down and you have to answer questions on craft, on manuscripts that you've read, all those different kind of things. In my program, instead of an actual exam, the comprehensive exam was a 15-page essay.
Okay.
And that was really interesting because we had to write an essay on our thesis without mentioning our thesis.
Oh, wow.
So the way that we did that was we had to pick books that exemplified something that we were tackling in our manuscript.
Okay.
And analyze why those things worked and why we were attracted to those.
Oh, wow.
So I wrote about a Maggie Stiefvater book. I wrote about The Outsiders. And I wrote about a short story, and now the name escapes me. But I had to, talk about found family was basically what I was tackling. But by picking apart each of those.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So that was something that in most programs they'll have you do it's usually in your second year between the first and second semester. So
Okay.
over Christmas break is usually when those things will be due. The thesis, on the other hand, is it's your manuscript.
Yeah.
The goal of an MFA program is that you walk away with a completed or partially completed work that's almost ready for publication.
I should have said that. That is the only other thing I knew about MFAs was okay, at the very least, I would have possibly a finished manuscript and the capacity to do it, because I am, as you said, in this bubble. Nothing else is a distraction. It's deadlines, which I love deadlines.
Me too.
Yeah, and just I accountability in a way that I don't have now as someone who's just pursuing it on his own. Is truly, when I look back and think about should I have done it, should I do it now, is something that is still very attractive to me is the possibility of having the time to have a very close to complete manuscript.
Right. And I think that's why a lot of people end up going into their MFA program later on.
Yeah.
My friend, and she won't mind that I'm talking about her, my friend who's going to school in New York right now, she was my colleague. And, as we were editing books after books after books, she kind of said to me, do you ever have time to write? And I said, I have the time, but I just don't. It was just one of those things, I haven't written for pleasure in a long time. And she was like, I'm really considering quitting my job and going into my MFA program and coming out with my poetry chapbook.
Wow.
That I've been putting off
to do
for years. Yeah. And I was kind of go for it. If you can make it happen, make it happen. I worked while I got my MFA degree, not full time, but I had 3 part-time jobs.
Nice. Oh, so you were working full time.
Yeah. And that's kind of I was making money because I had to, but I was able to do it in a way that allowed me to focus on my classes.
Yeah.
So I think it is that it's different from getting your bachelor's, where I feel I don't know if this was the culture on your campus, but on my campus, if you were kind of outside the traditional timeline for getting your bachelor's, people kind of side-eyed you. why are you here? What are you doing here as a 40 or 50-year-old?
Yes.
And the rest of us are in our very early 20s. Yes.
Yes. I had a in my undergrad, I had a fellow student who I loved. She was such a sweet soul, and she felt very insecure about the fact that she was in her 40s pursuing her creative writing degree, and we kind of were like, don't worry about that. Like, don't worry about that. And I feel is a reason why I hesitate to do it now as someone who's no longer in his 20s. I don't care about that, but that like I would worry about feeling isolated.
Right.
Yeah.
And that, I will say, that is something that's very different in an MFA program.
Okay, good.
It was actually that I was the oddball because
Oh, right.
And they did say my first year, they were like, you're the baby.
Oh, wow.
So I was significantly younger. I think I was at least 5 years younger than the next person.
Okay.
Which was fine.
Yeah,
like,
of course.
It wasn't like they singled me out and they were like, oh, you don't know how to write or
Right.
like whatever. But it was just a totally different attitude.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you had people coming from corporate careers. You had people coming from nonprofit careers. You had people who had been publishing and like putting on stage plays for years. And they were
Right.
just like, you know, I really want to be in an environment where I can sit down and just write this one thing. And I did have a friend who, that was his whole goal in the program. He's like, I know exactly what I want to write, and
Wow.
I'm here to write it. And that was his thesis. And then he got it published.
No way.
I think the year after we graduated, I think.
I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, so he was like, I'm here to do a thing. And then he did the thing.
And I
Well,
did
I
it,
was just
yeah.
kind of like, I have no idea why I'm here. I'm just showing up.
Just straight up vibes. Yeah.
Yep. So I think that is something that I really appreciated about the MFA
Yeah.
program. And oddly, a lot of lawyers,
Okay,
a
I
lot
actually
of lawyers.
was going to ask you that because that's the other advice. If you're an undergrad English student, I don't know if you heard this a lot, but I heard a lot like, well, consider law school. I was like, why?
And
What about
that's-
me screams law? But a lot of English students decide to get a law degree, and a lot of law students I've heard
Yes.
go for their MFA in creative or in writing.
And that is like, it was so strange to me to see that, especially because my partner, at that time, his track was going to be a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was studying the LSAT. He got his master's degree in public policy, but he was taking law classes from the law school at his university at the same time. And he was like, you should go to law school with me when you're done with your MFA. And I was like, absolutely not.
I love you, but no.
And he was like, you don't even have to do the bar. Like you, and I was like, no.
No, why would I do it? Well, I shouldn't say that. We have a contributor who has done that, and
Oh yeah.
it's brilliant.
Yes.
I could not do it.
Yeah, you guys should definitely pick up, if you haven't already, the January-February issue.
Yeah.
We do have a brilliant article
Yes.
in there about how going to law school can make you a better business savvy
Yes.
writer.
Yeah, and it's brilliant.
I know this is a lot of information to take in, everybody. I hope that this chat has answered some of your questions, but if it hasn't, don't worry about it. Michael and I are going to continue this conversation in our February episode, so stay tuned for part 2.
I am pleased to be here today with Susan Shapiro, an award-winning writer and professor who is the best-selling author and co-author of 17 books her family hates in 8 different genres, including Unhooked, The Forgiveness Tour, 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, Lighting Up, The Bosnia List, and her inspiring writing guide, The Byline Bible, which I had the pleasure of working on. She has freelanced for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, Salon, The New Yorker, and many, many more. She lives with her scriptwriter husband in Greenwich Village, where she has taught her popular Instant Gratification Takes Too Long courses at the New School, New York University, Columbia University, and in private classes and seminars, which are now online. Susan Shapiro, welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm thrilled to be talking to you today about your new writing guide, The Book Bible, How to Sell Your Manuscript No Matter What Genre Without Going Broke or Insane, which just got a starred review from Booklist. It's out January 4th, 2022 from Skyhorse Publishing. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to start off by telling us a little bit about how this book came to be. What gave you the idea for it?
Well, we did uh, Byline Bible, and that did well. And a lot of my students told me that they wish that I would do, well, a lot of my students sold short pieces that led to books. And so then they would ask a million questions about, what do I do next? How do I do this? And one of the biggest confusions I saw was trying to figure out what genre, what category of book somebody new would have the best luck selling. And lately I've been doing these sell your book seminars online, and I find that people are very confused by that. And actually Writer's Digest ran the piece which made it into the book, which was genre fluidity. So I think it's something that people don't really understand. And because I have this strange overview of, I've done 17 books in 8 different genres, and so I have a good overview, an unusual overview. In fact, I used to think that I sort of came off like a, literary dabbler with ADD because I kept switching around. But it turns out that the one thing it's good for is when people throw out their ideas and we try to figure out which category. It's the one weird thing that I learned by screwing up so many genres and trying again and revising and, so that was how it started, I think.
I was going to ask you about your genre hopping. In chapter 4 of the book Bible, you talk about nonfiction book proposals, and you talk about positioning yourself as the author for the book that you're proposing and not sharing every detail of every writing success you've ever had. You gave the example of not mentioning your books about addiction when proposing your co-authored books about Bosnia. Could you talk a little bit more about that idea and how you've been able to consistently reinvent yourself as a writer?
Yes. I mean, what's interesting is that I find it's a problem with my students, even doing short pieces. So sometimes the newspaper editor, the magazine editor will say, do you want a bio? And they'll put a 74-line bio. And it's just like, majored in philosophy and minored in psychology and went to Ohio State, but then went to graduate school in England and has traveled the world and is a motorcycle enthusiast. And I'm just like, why are you saying that? In fact, just recently I just said to a student, just write, working on a book about, traveling worldwide, like just one line. And interestingly, I have a lot of students who have used a very short byline mentioning they're working on a book and then gotten a book deal or gotten literary agents or editors to call them. So I feel like in general, writers do that a lot. I don't know why. I mean, maybe people in other fields do it too, but inside a book proposal, there might be room for several pages of your whole life story, especially if it's going to help you sell the book. But I find that selling one particular piece and selling a book, you really just want to hone in on the exact information that's going to help you sell a book. And if you give the wrong information, it'll screw it up. That might lead the history editor to think this is an unstable person, So a lot of times people just give way too much, way wrong information. So I try to have my students hone in on what's your platform? Why should somebody say yes to this? And actually I have an editor who says to my students, all I want in a pitch is why you, why me, why now?
So one of the things that I love about this book is that you start each chapter with a tongue-in-cheek, funny list of what not to do for writing that kind of book. And I mean, you identify literally the exact problems that I have seen most often with people who are trying to propose something and going about it the exact wrong way. So I wondered, why did you choose to start each chapter that way?
I'm so glad that you said that. Okay, so my goal with Byline Bible and with Book Bible is you never want to be boring. And sometimes when you're writing a guide with a lot of lists and a lot of service elements, you're, do this, do that, it's boring. So I was trying to find a way to be more interesting. And I think I had actually, maybe a while ago for Writer's Digest, I'd sort of written a what not to do kind of piece. And so I tried that. And interestingly, I have this really tough, brilliant writing group. And several people didn't like it and thought it was sarcastic or negative. And what's interesting was there were 5 or 6 former students who were much younger than my brilliant editors and agents, and all of them liked it immediately. And I asked them to explain why, and they said because they saw themselves doing every single one,
Yeah.
and also it made them laugh. And so the minute they could laugh and sort of make fun of themselves, then they liked me more. So interestingly, the older people who are sort of more traditional publishing thought it was a little too sarcastic, obnoxious, making fun of people. But when I saw all the young people, the younger students, diverse younger students actually, when they told me they liked it and they got it and they laughed and they saw themselves, that's when I knew I had to do it more because they're my audience.
Right.
The audience that I want is, I want people that have never done or I think I'm going to have an audience of people who haven't done a book before, and especially young people, because what happens is, when you Google or you go to a bookstore, you could certainly get, how to write a memoir, how to write a novel. But there was no book that I could find that crossed genres.
Right.
So I really wanted to put it together in the most helpful way imaginable. And I think there are specific problems with each genre. So for example, kids books, because I have quite a few students who've done kids books, a really common thing a parent will do is, well, my kid loves this story, or I'm going to tell this story of when I grew up in 1978,
Right.
and so there were, and poetry, it's, okay, I'm going to get an agent for my poetry and sell it to the New Yorker. And it's like, I don't think agents handle most poetry, and I don't think the New Yorker is the place to start. So each genre people seem to have misconceptions about. So, by the way, it was very fun. It was the most fun to write.
I think that's what appeals to me about your writing style is you don't mince words, but it's humorous in a way that gets the point across while allowing people to like laugh at themselves without feeling bad about what they didn't know and what they've just learned. In this book, each of the chapters has so many examples of books that do the thing well that's being talked about in that chapter. How long did it take you to do the research for this book, or did you just accumulate this knowledge over time?
On one hand, I'm lucky because I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I was a book reviewer and for many years. So in some of the genres, I knew this stuff off the top of my head. That my biggest problem was that some of my references were old. So I definitely wanted to update when possible. The other thing that was great was I interviewed maybe 100 people for this book, editors and agents and authors. And so quite often they would add names to it. Oh, you have to have this one, you have to. And I really did want it to be diverse. I was glad that Booklist said that. So, for example, there was an LGBTQ author, and I was like, okay, could you tell me some of your favorite writers we should be looking at? Or, a Latino journalist and a Black best-selling author whose work I admired. And, so I really was trying to get the widest range of examples I could, especially now in the publishing industry. Thank God the publishing industry has finally decided they seem to figure out that diversity is a good way to go.
Right.
So, so I was trying to be as all-inclusive as possible. It didn't take a long time to research because I loved, it's so much fun. I just love doing it. So it's very fun to, for me to ask a lot of editors and agents if they could recommend, or my writing group would add, and there were really funny arguments because is it a cozy mystery? Is it a thriller? Is it crime? So I had to go to experts, and I think I have a disclaimer at one point, which is I'm trying to categorize, but there's so many things that cross genres. But what's that great line about if you love what you do, you never have to work a day in your life.
Yeah.
So it really was so much fun. And by the way, there's nothing else I've thought about for basically 40 years. So, how can I get published? How can I make this better? What would the editor say yes to? So it is kind of fun. It was kind of fun to obsess about it.
Well, so if you have been thinking about this for 40 years and accumulating this knowledge, as you were interviewing those 100 people or the experts that you include in each of the chapters, which type of book or writing style did you learn the most about while you were interviewing them?
Well, interestingly, I just did my first co-authored middle grade book. Oh. So I have a ton of students who have published great middle grade YA picture books. but it wasn't a genre that I knew much about. And I basically had a crash course in trying to figure it out. And it took me a long time because so I did the Bosnia list with Kenneth Jabincevic, and he did a piece for Newsday about what happened when his family, his Bosnian Muslim family, escaped ethnic cleansing and came to America. And there was a council of synagogues and churches in Connecticut that saved his family. And he did a short piece on it. And a former student who's a kids book editor said this would make an amazing middle grade memoir. So I'm like, what's a middle grade memoir? So it took us a long time to figure out from start to finish. I think it was 5 years, because not only do you have to understand that kids books are a completely different genre, but there's a huge difference between middle grade and YA, and there's a huge difference between middle grade memoir versus middle grade novel. And finally, the editor, who had published a similar book based on an immigrant true story, decided to call it based on a true story and call it a novel. But it took me so long to figure out. And I always say you should read the book you wanted to write and teach the class you had wanted to take. And so basically this was the book that I wish I would have had a long time ago, because it just took me so long to figure out each genre, even poetry. You know, I moved to New York to get my graduate degree in poetry, and it took me a good 10 years to like figure out that I'll never make any money in poetry. And that as much as I loved it, that, you know, I was just going about it the wrong way with unrealistic expectations. Yeah. So I really wanted a 17 or 18 or 20-year-old or someone from a different field to just pick up a book and really just get a overview of what's doable, what's not doable, what's the time frame, what's the reality in this genre. So that's what I was hoping for.
Well, and I think so many people do want to write in so many, or have ideas for so many different genres. And, so having all of the information for all of those different kinds of books in one comprehensive, book itself was a really smart choice. And I think it helps, like you said, if you are writing something and it morphs as you are drafting to something different, this will give you an idea of how you can position it better, so that you have a more realistic opportunity to
Thank you. And
it.
Also, truthfully, there's, if you spend 5 years getting rejected, do something else, So
right.
A very, like just for an example, a really common thing I'm seeing right now in my online, the Sell Your Book students, is memoir is a hard sell at this particular moment.
Really?
And maybe there were earlier times, for example, I did humorous memoirs, 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, Lighting Up, How I Stopped Smoking, Drinking, and Everything Else I Loved in Life Except Sex. So there was a point when it was easier to sell a humorous memoir. These days it's much harder. And I think that from what I'm hearing from a lot of the editors and agents who Zoom into my class, maybe part of it was the pandemic. Maybe part of it was the books that are really doing well are very dramatic. So you have Educated and Made and Hillbilly Elegy and Memorial Drive. So you have books that are really, really high concept, dramatic, intense stories. So I was depressed and went on antidepressants and broke up with my mate isn't going to really cut it if you're not famous. So I knew a lot of authors who felt sort of heartbroken that here we've spent a lot of time either on a proposal or a memoir proposal or a memoir manuscript. And, after 2 years or 5 years or 10 years with everything else going for you and you're in love with your story, what do? Do you give up? And so in several cases, proteges and people from my writing groups and classes were able to take what they did, which was a first person memoir, and rethink it a little bit to make it publishable. In fact, that happened to me several times, so I knew how to do it. So for example, the book that actually introduced me to Writer's Digest was I wrote a book called Only as Good as Your Word, Writing Lessons from My Favorite Literary Gurus. And it originally started as straight memoir called Lies My Mentors Told Me. And nobody would buy it. And I was told it was a let-in title. And when I asked, they said it wasn't commercial. And when I said, why not? They said, because it's 8 profiles of old people and 3 of them are dead. And they're just like, not going to happen. Okay. And I was trying to figure out what to do. And luckily I met a great editor from a smaller press who understood what I was trying to do. And she said, why don't you make this like a service book for writers, so that add more takeaways and an introduction and an end, how to get mentors to your own. And that way we know who the audience is. So I did that. So that felt miraculous, and it breathed life into that book. And actually it introduced me to an editor at Writer's Digest who hired me for a long time. So that kept happening. And what happened was it would take a lot of analyzing and asking editors and agents and asking my writing group to sort of stumble on what genre might work. And nobody really talks about that. But anyway, so that happened with several students of mine and several people. Amy Klein, who was in my writing group, was writing great infertility pieces for the New York Times and didn't have luck with a memoir about her infertility, but she had great luck selling this fantastic book called The Trying Game to Random House for six figures. And that was where you help other women who were going through infertility so she could use her first person story, but just added research. And that was a huge success. And another former student, Laura Zam, had a book called The Pleasure Plan. And again, it was, so after you've been through sexual abuse, how do you enjoy sex? And by making it into a service, more service oriented, she found a great editor, agent, and audience. So that happens a lot. So, so that's a really good thing for people to think about, because what it means is that just because your memoir doesn't sell doesn't mean it's over. If you could be a little bit flexible and figure out who might be the audience or how could you rework it. And some of my memoirs that sold, we're talking a month of work to be able to get a great publisher and have and breathe life into a project that I thought was dead.
Well, this episode is all about beginnings because it is our first podcast episode, and it's coming out in January, the beginning of a new year. So I wonder, do you have a couple tips that you would offer to someone who wanted to start working toward their first byline or their first book in 2022?
Sure. Well, first off, read what you want to be writing. You can't write in a vacuum. If you want to write a novel, go out, be a good literary citizen, buy books, and by the way, don't buy Stephen King, buy debut authors who are trying, who are just breaking out in small presses or, so read what you want to be writing. That's really important. And it's the same thing with newspapers and magazines. And by the way, if you want to write for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or Oprah Magazine or Cosmo, buy them. You buy them. How are you going to make money if you're getting them for free? It's like a karma thing, so read what you want to be writing. If you could afford it, be a good literary citizen and help the genre, help the field in general by being a patron, being a good patron. And by the way, go to book events, go to bookstores, or there won't be any bookstores, go to book events. So I think that there's a whole karma thing that happens there. Number one. Number two, in terms of a book, I always say, and interestingly, it helps. It's great that we did Byline Bible, because the best way to publish a book is to write 3 brilliant pages. And it's a million times easier to write 3 pages than it is 300 pages. Yeah. And if you can't write 3 pages and get it published, chances are it's not a book then.
That's
so that's really a very good way to try to launch it, because if you launch it, that means somebody has to come up with a title, a subtitle, who's your audience, where are you going to pitch it, telling a story that's engaging. And so that's really a great way to start, because it'll tell you a lot. And sometimes people start with a piece and they didn't even realize, it'll hit a nerve, and then literary agents and editors will call them.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, read Byline Bible and Book Bible first.
For sure. Really, I mean,
and Writer's Digest, by the way. I love Writer's Digest. You guys,
I love Writer's Digest too.
Such great information.
Well, I think so do your books. They really are so very comprehensive. You are very generous with your knowledge and what you have learned. And again, I like the way that you present it in a way that is entertaining, and I can hear your voice in my head whenever I'm reading them, which I think is fantastic. So
my students say that. They always tell me they could hear too many words, or start timely. Why are you starting so old? Yeah. So they hear sort of little suisms.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I hope everyone picks up a copy of the Book Bible, and of course the Byline Bible too, because I'm partial to that one. Thank you. I'm glad you're able to join us.
Thank you. Me too.
We will close out each episode of the podcast by sharing a writing prompt related to our episode theme. Here's this month's prompt. Introduce your character to a new hobby. How do they learn the hobby? What intrigues them about it? Are they a natural from the beginning, or do they have to work at it to become somewhat good at it? What does it teach them, or you, about who they are? Or if you write nonfiction, replace the character with yourself. Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Join us next month when we'll be talking about Flash Fiction February. Until then, you can find book recommendations from the WD staff at bookshop.org/shop/Writer's Digest. And visit writersdigest.com for more writing prompts, advice, and inspiration. You can always email us at writers.digest@aimmedia.com. There are 2 M's in there. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Happy writing.